Gracias por venir. Lo primero, pues quería informaros de que Bob es uno de los profesores de la Universidad CEDIM, a la cual yo represento. Aquí en México tenemos una sede de posgrados, diplomados, masterclass. Él es profesor del masterclass Organizational Design. No me voy a dilatar mucho, quiero pediros un favorcito. Delante vuestra hay unas fichas como esta, la cual agradecería muchísimo que me rellenaseis por ambas caras, por las dos, que siempre hay algún despistado. Os lo agradecería muchísimo, quiero mantener mi trabajo aquí en México, entonces pues es parte de, me podéis ayudar con eso. Y os voy a dar una breve presentación de Bob y ya vamos a dar pie a la plática. Bob Gower es una autoridad dentro del coaching y el asesoramiento del diseño organizacional. Ayuda a empresas del nivel de General Electric, Ford, Travelers a ser más eficaces en sus estructuras organizacionales. Además de esto, pues tiene un máster en gestión sostenible, es profesional de psicología positiva y autor del libro Agile Business, guía de un líder para aprovechar la complejidad. Si os interesa este libro, podéis contactar con él para una versión electrónica. Y bueno, como os dije antes, además es profesor de nuestro Masterclass en Organizational Design. Sin más por el momento, pues bueno, Bob, thank you for coming and go ahead.
Good morning? No, good afternoon, everybody. I'm a little confused as to what time it is. I don't speak Spanish. I hope that's okay. Yeah, we're all good? Okay, good. I'm Bob. I'm from New York City. I understood some of what she said. I have worked with a lot of companies on improving their organization, improving how we come together, collaborate, work on things, and build things. This has been my passion for at least 10 years, if not before. And it comes from a couple of different places. So first I kind of want to start off talking about organizations in general, and then we're going to get into the speed part, because I think speed and productivity is really fundamental. If an organization is not working well, one of the first places it shows up is that we don't do much, that not much comes out of that organization, right? So it turns out it's very, very slow. So I'm going to share with you kind of some of my thinking about how to improve the effectiveness and the productivity of your organization. But first off, let's start off with kind of thinking about organizations. So I'm really passionate about this about organizations for a couple of reasons. One is that as a human, our ability to come together, our ability to collaborate, our ability to build things together is really kind of a superpower. If you look at a human, we are not terribly impressive animals, right? We don't have big teeth. Our big brains are okay. But if you put us by ourselves out in the forest, we're not going to do very well. If you put 10 of us together out in the forest, we stand a much, much, much bigger chance of survival. And so humans really, we need each other. If we don't get to touch another human being, especially as a baby, we will die. We will actually become depressed and we will die. So organizations are really fundamental to who we are as a human being. They're really wonderful things and they help us build things. You can't quite see this picture, it's the Great Wall of China. But all of the great big things on the planet that are visible from space, they are built by groups of people. And so they're really fundamental to our productivity and to kind of who we are as a species. There's a dark side to this, though, of course, as well. They are also our curse, and you can't quite see the picture there, but this is a picture of a lot of pollution. But we could also use examples of the Nazis, we could use examples of big armies. All of the bad things that humans do on the planet, we also do together. And so one of the questions that's been really fundamental to my work is, why do groups of kind, smart people do stupid and cruel and unkind things, right? So kind of fundamental to my work is trying to improve not only the output of organizations, but trying to improve the behavior of organizations, right? Trying to make our organizations better global citizens and trying to make our organizations let's say kinder, helping more humans do better things. You guys understand? You guys get this? Yeah, I feel like it kind of makes sense. Does anybody here feel like they've ever been inside of an organization that's kind of, even though the people around them, even though the organization is full of nice people, that the organization itself is kind of doing some dumb or bad things in the world? Maybe, just a little bit? Maybe we've seen, not where we work now, of course, right? But other organizations at other times. So the goal, my goal as an organizational designer, so I'm hired by organizations to improve their functioning. And my goal as an organizational designer is to create organizations that fit their environment and are also able to achieve their goals more effectively. But there's kind of a trend in the world these days. Now let's see if any of these things resonate with you. I'm going to describe a couple of things, a couple of experiences inside of organizations. Let's see if they correspond to your experience. So one, your organization struggles to keep up with the pace of change, right? So the market is changing faster than we are. Strategic plans are obsolete in a matter of weeks or months, or well-intended controls have become a bureaucracy that's slowing us down. Does anybody ever feel like their organization is like slowing down the work, right? Everyone is overwhelmed by the sheer complexity of your scale or your scaling, right? So if you're a small company, you're scaling fast, and that has a lot of complexity to it. Or if you're a really big company, then the scale of your organization makes it actually more difficult to get things done, makes it more difficult to achieve your purpose. Our customers and partners find it difficult to do business with us. The middle one is my favorite. The deluge of email and meetings distracts us from actual work. Does anybody ever feel like they're not able to really get to their work because they have to answer an email, or they have to do a meeting, or they have to, like it's just sort of, we're overwhelmed by the complexity of our organizations. And third, our culture can frustrate our best people and turn off top prospects. So in today's business world, the world I operate inside of, we need people. We need good people. We need to attract good people to our organizations. And often the culture of our organization or the scale of our organization, we just can't attract the top talent. Our future leaders are constantly fighting against the processes and controls. And our people are reeling from constant reorgs and pivots. Has anybody ever been through a corporate reorganization? No? It's very common in most organizations that I operate inside of that they are going to change their structure on a really regular basis. Like every 2 years or so, they'll bring in a consultant from the outside, someone like myself, who will then change everybody's job, change everybody's title, they'll change everything. This is the sort of the common, you've seen this? Okay, great. I'm glad I'm seeing some nods in the audience. So we see this as a kind of a common pattern. So all of these things are actually a sign of something else. They're a sign of the times that we're living in. And if you haven't heard this term before, you will be hearing it soon, but VUCA. We live in a VUCA world, and VUCA stands for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. So increasingly, our markets and our technology and our social systems are all moving faster and faster and faster and faster. And we're getting more and more volatility, we're getting more uncertainty, more complexity. And it's just really a hard time to be in business. It's a really challenging time, and it's causing our traditional business systems, they're starting to crack and they're starting to break down. What I and my colleagues have noticed, though, is that there are some businesses that are actually doing pretty well. And this is a list, a partial list, of some businesses that I think, and that I and my colleagues, we've actually been doing a research project for the last several years, trying to determine what businesses are operating very, very well in this kind of VUCA world. We have Gower, which is a materials science organization. We have Google, of course. JSOC, which is actually a military organization that sits inside the US government. They're sort of a special operations. Whole Foods, which is a grocery chain. Netflix, you probably know. Valve is a gaming platform, a video game platform, one of the most successful and most profitable video gaming platforms out there. Red Hat is, of course, enterprise software. Morningstar is the largest processor of tomatoes in the United States. So it's an agricultural organization. Bertzorg is a Dutch healthcare company, and then Spotify. You all know Spotify, right? Do you know Spotify? Spotify is a music streaming service, so I have it on my phone, and I get to listen to all of my music through Spotify. All of these organizations are not identical, But they all are answering the problem that we're inside of, this VUCA world, in kind of a unique way. The term we've come up with for this is responsive. So the idea is that we can sense the environment and respond to it. So we create organizations that are able to sense and respond. So a responsive organization. So the goal of a responsive organization, responsive organizations change and continuously adapt to their environment. So my role as an organizational designer is to design organizations that are capable of being responsive. So I'm not interested in redesigning the traditional hierarchy inside of an organization. What I am interested in doing is creating more capability to respond to the market. And what we notice is that if we do work via hierarchy, you guys understand what I say when I say hierarchy? We have like the president, and then we have the vice presidents, then we have the directors, and then we have, you get down here to the people doing the work. And traditionally what we have is we have the people down here doing the work are following orders from the people way up here. And the orders have to flow all the way down, and information has to flow all the way back up. And of course, as information flows up, it gets confused, and then as orders flow down, they get confused, and it's very, very slow and very, very unresponsive. And so what we're trying to do is trying to design a new kind of organization that is able to sense and respond in a much more dynamic way in the market, because there's just not enough time. Things are volatile, things are uncertain, things are moving quickly, and there's not enough time to have that information flow up and to have the orders flow down. So let's talk about this a little bit, and let's talk about this in context of productivity or speed, because that's what I came here to talk about today, was speed. So let me ask you this. If you have a job and you look at the amount of work you have to do, and you realize you have about 2 months worth of work to do, but you only have a month to deliver in, the kinds of things we might do in order to speed up. Well, I actually have a list. So I have a list of things. I'm speaking through a microphone, so we're not going to do too much questioning today. We tend to work longer hours, right? So if I have a lot of work to do, I'm going to work longer hours. If I have a lot of work to do, I might work more frantically. You guys, understand frantically? Like I might run, I might try to keep my head down and just try to work really hard. And that, of course, causes, or maybe I even strategically decide to cut corners on quality. I decide that I'm not going to have as much quality because, I don't have time. Does this make sense? Has everybody tried this kind of strategy before? All right. So this is sort of the natural human way to do things. If we have too much to do, if our boss is yelling at us, we work longer hours, we work more frantically, and we lower quality. If we continue to do this for a long period of time, what happens? Are customers happy? No. Is our wife or our husband at home happy? Right? So this leads to negative outcomes for the customer, it leads to negative outcomes for the company, and it leads to negative outcomes for all of the workers inside the organization. It's not that we shouldn't do this sometimes, right? When it's crunch time, I work longer hours. I'm in the midst of a 2 or 3 week period where I'm not getting any days off right now, so I'm very familiar with this. But at the same time, I know that I'm going to need a rest on the other side, that when I get back home to New York next Monday, then I'm going to need to take a good day off and rest and be with my family and recharge and rebuild, not rebuild, but appreciate and put time into my relationships rather than just be focused on work. So before we talk about speed, I want us to agree on something. And I want us to agree that when it comes to the amount of time we're putting into work, the pace that we're working at, and the level of quality that we're working at, that we're going to begin to treat these as more fixed qualities rather than flexible qualities, right? It's not that they're not somewhat flexible. They're a little flexible. We can work longer hours for a short period of time. We can work at a frantic pace or a faster pace for a short period of time. And there may be opportunities to lower quality. It may be that we have overestimated the level of quality that we want to put into something in the first place, and so we need to lower quality a certain degree, right? So I do a lot of work in technology. So if I'm working with, let's say, a gaming company, games you can often lower quality quite a bit. But if I'm working with a healthcare company or a finance company, we really don't want to lower quality at all, right? We want to really agree on a base level of quality. Data integrity, usability, these kinds of things are hugely important. So before we start a project, we really want to have a sense of What's the level of quality we're going to work to? When we build an organization, we want to build into our culture the right pace, because because if we're working too frantically, has anybody ever seen someone run in their office? Like really like run? Yeah. I think that's a little crazy. I've done it, but I think it's a little bit crazy. Our work is important. I mean, don't get me wrong. I think your jobs are important. I think my job is important. But if you watch a firefighter, like someone who is really working in an emergency situation, and someone for whom quality is incredibly important because it's literally a life and death situation, they are slow, they are deliberate, and they are focused, right? They may run in a strategic burst for one moment, but they don't just run around all the time. And when I walk into an office and I see people running around, I think they need me. I think maybe I can do something here. Maybe there's an opportunity. So the first thing we really need to think about with speed is we need to kind of standardize. We need to say, look, we're going to spend this amount of time, we're going to work at this pace, that's kind of a cultural thing, and we're going to work to a certain level of quality. Can everybody kind of agree with me that this is a good idea? To kind of, we have these conversations up front. We don't have these conversations later, but as we begin a project, we really say, well, what does quality mean? How are we going to know when the customer is happy? How are we going to know when the customer is unhappy? Let's agree on this and let's kind of standardize on it. So, I flashed ahead there momentarily. So if we are to standardize on these things, this only leaves us a couple of things that we can do in order to speed up. But in order to do that, we need to understand what speed is. And for this, I'm going to get a little bit technical with you. Just a little bit. No math, but just a little bit technical. My background is in something called lean manufacturing and agile software development, which is lean manufacturing as applied to the development of complex systems like software. And so I'm going to give you some of the foundations of lean. Has anyone heard? You guys have heard of lean, right? You guys have some background. So maybe this will be new. Maybe this will be old hat to some of you and new to some of you. So speed is actually comprised of two things. The first is throughput, and the second is cycle time. And I want to describe what those things are so you have a little bit of background. So if you end up at a cocktail party with someone who is a lean expert, you can use these words intelligently. And I also want to talk to you about how we can manipulate these two things as well. And there's really only a couple of things we can do. It's actually rather simple. So if we're going to understand throughput, the easiest way to understand throughput is to think of a kilometer of highway, right? And when you have a certain number of cars, so the throughput is the total number of cars that this section of highway can process per hour. So we can measure it. It's very, very clear, right? We have a time element, the hour, and we have a distance element, and then we have a unit element, right? So when you have those three things, now we can measure throughput. So our goal is to maximize throughput. We want as many cars as possible. If we want to increase efficiency, we want to have as many cars as possible going through that highway. So we naturally try to create something that looks like this, right? This looks like we're maximizing throughput, right? No, okay, good, yeah, because that is what happens when you try. Looks like Mexico City, right? Like we end up. I'm a New Yorker, yeah. I ride the subway though. I don't ride in cars, but yes. Yeah, I mean this could be New York. This could be my neighborhood in New York. I live under a highway, kind of. But we end up trying to fill our system filled with cars, and we end up with what we might call gridlock, right? Everything comes to a halt. The reason for this is that the cars tend to kind of bump into each other. A system which looks like this is what we would call a brittle system. It's a system that's very, very prone to failure. And once it fails, it can't recover from that failure. So if we're thinking about work, if we're thinking about the amount of work that we want to do, we could think of this piece of work as a project. We could think of this car as a project. And when we pack our brains full of projects, or when we pack our teams full of projects, we tend to lose details. They tend to bump into each other. We tend to spend a lot of time in email, a lot of time in a project management system, because we have to track all sorts of details. And these details start to bump into each other. And so I think the cognitive load, what we call like the load of our brain with projects, is very similar to the load of a highway with cars. So what lean manufacturing would say is that in order to maximize throughput, we actually have to introduce some space into the system, and they call that space slack. Is everyone familiar with the software product Slack? It's a $1 billion startup, yeah. So, and they actually called it that because they're trying to create slack in the system. That's actually where this name came from. So the idea behind Slack is that we want to actually focus on having some space in the system, and when we have enough space in the system, we can maximize throughput, right? So this is going to have a better throughput than this, right? And the same is true of our work. The easiest way to introduce Slack into a system is to introduce something that's called a WIP limit, and a WIP limit stands for work in process. So the idea is that we put a sensor on one end of the system, and we put a gate on the other, and until one item leaves that system and creates space, we actually allow it to pull this, I learned the word the other day, jale, right? Am I right? Am I getting right? So we create a pull-based system. Most systems in most organizations are what we would call push-based, right? So you get a project because your boss comes by and says, here, do this, and then walks away from your desk, right? So it's a push. So we're pushing as much work into our system. Back when I was managing teams, I would frequently ask teams for a lot more than I thought I could get from them. And I thought that was the way to maximize productivity, was to push as much work on them, and that they would be forced to then kind of, you know, do as much work as possible. They would work frantically, they would work long hours, they would cut quality, and then that was how we would maximize the system. But really, this is what a healthy throughput looks like. This is what a system that maximizes throughput looks like, and we get there by limiting our work in process. This brings us to cycle time. So I love coffee, and I spend a lot of time waiting in line at coffee shops because of that. It's one of my, I do it probably 3 times a day. So every time I walk into a coffee shop, I will look at the line, and I'm going to do a quick assessment of cycle time in my head. So my assessment is, how long am I going to have to wait to get my cup of coffee, right? So let's say we've maximized throughput over here, and this guy is making coffee as fast as he can at the level of quality that the coffee shop requires, right? That doesn't matter at all to me if this line is very long and I'm going to have to wait a really long time to get my cup of coffee, right? So I'm going to walk in, I'm going to see this line, and I'm going to turn around and walk out. But if I walk in and see a line that looks like that, I might stick around, right? And that's because we need to keep our queue or our line short in order to minimize cycle time. That's the only thing we can really do. We keep the queue short to minimize cycle time. So let's say we go and we see a line that looks like this, right? So we're going to have to start thinking, right? We're going to have to start thinking, well, what's on the other side of that line is going to have to be very, very, very valuable in order to get us to stand in that line and stay there. So lines in the real world have a way of being self-regulating based on the value of the thing at the other end, right? So I can walk into a coffee shop, and depending upon, like, 1, have I had coffee yet today? So how badly do I need this coffee? 2, how good is the coffee at that shop? And 3, are there other options in the neighborhood, right? Can I, I don't like Starbucks is okay, it'll do in a pinch, but, so can I go and get my coffee somewhere else? So we're going to make a natural assessment. I'm going to kind of come up to the line, I'm going to say, and I'm also going to try to make an assessment about what the throughput is, about how fast that line is moving. But the lines tend to be self-regulating in the real world. The only time we can really regulate lines, or we do sort of regulate lines, is the only way we kind of keep our queue short is by saying no. And the metaphor here would be, if you've ever been to like a fancy nightclub, there's a big line outside, but there's not much line inside, right? And the reason there's a big line, or there's a big line outside, and there's a shorter line inside full of really good-looking people or something, right? They're inviting like only the great people in. I don't know. I've never been in these clubs. I don't really know. But we create a barrier in order to preserve the experience here, right? So in order to keep the queue short, we actually have to say no to some people. So these are kind of exclusive clubs. They control access to their bar. Their bar line inside is manageable because they put another line outside and they turn people away, right? So what does this look like in a work system, right? So in a work system, we can imagine that these are projects. So the first thing we need to do is actually be able to make our projects a little bit independent of each other And most organizations aren't really good at thinking about projects, right? They think about work. They think about, oh, here, do this, right? But they don't really think about the value. Like, so the first thing we want to do is create a series of projects that have real value attached to them, and we want to make them a little bit smaller, right? We want to make them small so they're manageable in size. So that doesn't mean we don't have a big project, but it means we're getting good at breaking the big project down into small, digestible component pieces. I could go on and on about that. That's not really the scope of this particular talk, but that's kind of another talk about how to do that. But let me just sort of leave it there for now, that our goal is to have these kind of small, discrete projects flowing through our system. It allows us to measure. It allows us to visualize things much better. So what we do is we limit WIP. This is the work that's being done. And we keep the queue short. This is the work that we promised to do, right? So as soon as I say to somebody, yes, I will do that job, yes, I will do that project for you, that project enters a queue. All of a sudden, the clock starts ticking, right? Because someone is expecting something. They're expecting this thing to get done. But if I don't say, yes, I'm going to do that thing, then the clock has not started ticking yet, if I haven't committed. So what this means is that creating a system like this is really dependent upon saying no. This is not terribly popular. Doesn't make me very popular. I've done this many times. This is the role that I play inside of organizations as a product manager. So this is kind of the product management role often. But is to not commit to work until they're ready, right? This requires us, again, to have discrete projects. It also requires us to do a really good job of prioritizing those projects based on the value they will deliver to the customer and based on the value they'll deliver to the organization. So this isn't easy. I'm not saying this is easy. What I am trying to say is we need to visualize this and we need to get good at doing it, right? So this brings us to teams. And the promise of this talk is to talk about how do we build fast and productive teams. So to understand a fast and productive team is someone that's able to build a system that looks like this. And in order to build a system that looks like this, we need a few things in place. The first thing we need is that team needs to be empowered. They need to be empowered to say yes, and they need to be empowered to say no. Remember, if you cannot say no, your yes is essentially meaningless, right? So if somebody says, can you do this job? And you can't say, no, my plate is full, or I already have 5 projects and going right now. If I can't say no to this project, then I really can't say yes either. I'm a student of management systems, and so what I'm I was going to get into a long history of scientific management, but I will say that the idea that most of our organizations are built upon is a kind of management system that you can trace its roots back to slavery. You can trace it back to this is where it first began to be studied. This is where it first began to be described and articulated, was on slave plantations in the American South during the 1800s, right? The early 1800s. So many of us feel like slaves inside of our modern organization because we cannot say no, right? That's a fundamental. That's kind of the definition of being a slave, right? Sorry, I'm not trying to get everybody to quit their job, but this is sort of the background. This is the history. And most of my work is trying to get managers and leaders to move away from that mindset and move to another mindset. I'm going to describe the mindset in just a moment. So the first thing we want to have empowered teams. We want to have teams to be autonomous, and what that means is that they are actually able to complete work themselves. They don't need to depend upon approval from anybody else, and they don't need to depend upon necessarily collaborating with other teams. So the team itself usually is going to be cross-functional, right? It's going to have a lot of different skill sets represented on that team, so they're able to take one of these pieces of work and complete it, rather than wait for somebody else, wait for approval, or wait for information, or wait for resources from somebody else in order to do this. So empowered and autonomous. The other thing we need to keep teams small, because the bigger a team gets, the more communication overhead we get in that team. So we need to keep teams small and lean. Our recommendation is 5 to 9 people. So 7 people plus or minus 2. If you get less than 5, you probably don't have enough diversity of skill set or diversity of perspective on the team to do a good job. If you get over 9, you probably have too many people and you have to track, again, the cognitive load, the mental load of tracking all these conversations becomes really challenging. And last, we really want people to feel engaged. We want people to feel ownership of the team's mission. I like what I'm up to, and I'm committed to making it happen, right? If you have this, I don't care what kind of project management system you run, I don't care what kind of organization you're running, what kind of project you're building, but if you have a lean team of engaged people that are empowered and autonomous, you're going to have a fast-moving team. There's lots of different processes and tools and methodologies that help us get here, but this is where we're trying to get to. So this, remember I mentioned slavery. I'm going to talk about now kind of the mindset that sits behind this, because this is really fundamental to it, is we're not just changing our processes and our tools inside of our organizations, but we're actually changing the way we think about ourselves and the way we think about our organizations. This is especially important if you are a leader or a manager or if you are responsible for a team. And this has really been described, this was described by this guy McGregor back in 1960. And he talked about theory X people and theory Y people. So the theory X, let's see if this sounds familiar. So theory X says, on the whole, people dislike work and find it boring and will avoid it if they can. They must be forced or coerced to make the right effort. They would rather be directed than accept responsibility. They are motivated mainly by money and job security, and they have little creativity except for getting around the rules. Does this sound familiar? Right? This sounds like the mindset of many organizations. So this can go back, if you think about, if you've heard of Frederick Taylor, who was the father of scientific management back in the early part of the 20th century. He was building on the history of slavery, of course, and then he designed organizations that really had this built into them. So we use carrots and sticks. We use rewards, we use punishments in order to motivate people, right? So if you're going to motivate somebody, you have to give them a bonus, or you have to threaten them with some kind of punishment. Do what I say, or you're fired, right? This is fundamental to kind of the mindset of most organizations. Almost every organization on the planet is built with this mindset. Now, I'm not saying every leader has this mindset, because I know many wonderful leaders, but the organization, the structure of the organization, reinforces this kind of fear-based mindset. Theory Y, what McGregor said, is that on the whole, people need and want to work. People can self-direct in pursuit of a shared goal. People will seek responsibility and thrive on it. People are motivated by the desire to fulfill their potential and are highly creative under the right conditions. What I notice is when I speak to people, I show this slide all the time, I talk to a lot of people, is that most of us will say, that's me, right? This is me over here. But then most people will say, and these are the jerks that I work with, right? These are the people that I work with, right? And a lot of it has to do with our system. A lot of it has to do with the way our organizations are structured. Now remember, I mentioned that our organizations are built to reinforce this way of thinking. And so it's not surprising that your coworkers are showing up this way, or even you are showing up this way in the organization, even though we really kind of know this to be true. Like in our hearts, about ourselves, we kind of know that this is true. And so my work is really about how do we create organizations that are going to reinforce this kind of mindset rather than this kind of mindset. And this is challenging. This isn't easy work. And let me see if I can kind of describe it to you a little bit. So we talk about responsive organizations. This is not a responsive organization, right? This is an organization which is very slow, very brittle. This is an org chart from Union Pacific Railroad from, I think, like 1910, something like that. It's old. But it looks like the org chart from General Electric right now, right? I do a lot of work with GE. I'm not bad-mouthing them. They're wonderful people. And we really are moving away from this. Like a lot of our work is kind of helping them move away from this. But this has a deep hold on the organization. What we're interested in doing, when we say responsive organizational structure, I'm a little more interested in something that looks like this, where we have a whole system, and then I have, remember I described those teams, empowered, autonomous, lean teams. So we have an organization that's made up of these, and they're interrelated, and they may have some agreements and some ways of interacting with each other. They may even have some rules that govern how to create a new team, and they may even be able to create teams within themselves, so we can create a team of teams. The language team of teams actually comes from a US general who was in charge of the theater in Afghanistan, a guy named Stanley McChrystal. So if you want to read it, look for this book, Team of Teams. He describes it very, very well, especially how it shows up in a military structure. that military is very much structured like this, but we've been doing battle with terrorist cells for many years that are structured much, much more like this. It's much more dynamic. And so the US military has had to become much more dynamic and to respond to that threat. And we believe that all organizations need to become more dynamic like this in order to respond to the threat of the market, this VUCA world that I mentioned. So how do we get there? I got 3 more slides, and it's going to tell you everything you need to know in order to know that you need to hire me to come and help. All right, so the first thing is to think about is if we're going to move to a new style of organization, that a new style of organization is really based on simple rules. I love this particular slide. When I first discovered this this story, it helped me explain everything that a lot of things that I've been trying to explain for a long time. And what it helped me try to explain is, how do we create beautiful, complex, emergent behavior? How do we create a system that's capable of doing that? So back in 1986, in the early days of computer animation, one of the big questions was, how do we get a group of objects inside of a computer to behave like a flock of birds? How do we get that to happen, right? So flocks of birds are beautiful, it's emergent, it's valuable behavior. It helps them find food, it helps them avoid predators, right? So how do we get this to happen? So what most people were doing at the time was they were taking an individual object, and then they were plotting the trajectory of that object, and then they were taking another object, and they were describing the trajectory of that object, and they did this over and over and over and over again. And what they found was, one, is they ended up writing a lot of code. There was a lot, like lines and lines and lines of code, thousands of lines of code in order to describe that. And two, they ended up creating a system that broke down a lot. It just fell apart. A man named Craig Reynolds, who is from Queens, New York, and so he said birds, he pronounced it boids, and that's how this computer simulation came to be known as boids. But he had this insight, and his insight was, what if I gave every single object exactly the same rules to follow? And he did that. And the rules were separation, so steer to avoid crowding, and meaning really don't collide with, don't hit another object. 2, steer towards the average heading of your local flockmate, so kind of like align with them. And 3, cohesion, steer towards the average center, the average position of each, too. So you're not hitting anything else, you're kind of aligning with the things around you, and you're all steering in the same direction. And what he found was that he could create, this is a GIF, so it keeps looping through, but if this was the actual simulation, it would go on forever, and you would never see the same pattern twice. It would be beautiful, emergent. You could even throw another object through here. You could push another object through here, and this whole thing would respond to that object. It would respond to that object in a unique and interesting and valuable way. So this kind of emergent behavior. So what we're looking for when we redesign organizations is, what's the equivalent of these kinds of rules that we can give people? So rather than tell people exactly what to do, instead we give people a sense of purpose, we give people the tools that they need, and we get out of their way, right? So how do you map this? The way we map this is by, we've created this chart. We call this a canvas, and this is both a planning tool and it's a diagnostic tool for us. And so the idea is that if I'm designing an organization, that I want to put some simple rules together that govern the organization. Now the challenge is, we are not birds, and what we're up to is much, much, much more complex than birds. So we actually need probably some more rules, and we need rules in one context that may apply here, but this context is going to influence us over here, and so we need to have some relationship between the two. And sometimes, anyway, things can kind of get really complex. So we use this to map it. Now we start off with the purpose and values in the middle, because purpose, why we exist, and what our values are as a group is really fundamental to everything else. But then we also talk about structure and space, which is how our teams are organized. Are they organized around a product? Are they organized around a region? Are they organized around a skill set? How are our teams organized? Where do those teams meet? What's the space? What's the building like? Because the room can highly influence the kind of interaction, right? So we're in this room together, and you're all looking at me on stage, if we were all arranged in a circle, it would probably create a different kind of interaction, right? If I was sitting in a circle with everybody else, we might be having more conversation rather than, and I didn't have this microphone, right? We might have more of a conversation rather than me just speaking at you. So the space is really important. Authority and decisions, how are decisions made? What kind of authority does each person have? Again, because we want autonomous teams, so we actually have to define the authority, because we can't give them unlimited autonomy, right? We need to actually put some guardrails around their autonomy. The information and communication, how does information flow through the system? How do we communicate to people with each other, and how do we communicate outside the system? I mentioned the tool Slack before. We're a huge fan of Slack over email, right? Because email creates a certain kind of interaction. Slack and other tools, and even like face-to-face conversation, creates a completely different kind of interaction, and these things become really important. Meetings and rhythm and coordination. How do we meet? How do we talk to each other? How often do we meet? What happens in a meeting? Who's facilitating? These kinds of things. I do a lot of work here, and I do a lot of work here. That's kind of usually where I start in organizations. Policy and governance. How are we governed? And also, how do we create new policies? And how do we alter and retire old policies? Because most organizations are really good at creating policies, but they're not good at really getting rid of them once they're gone, once they're bad, once they're, once they're useless. And so we get this bureaucracy that builds up over time. So we're often looking at how that's created. People development and motivation. So this is maybe traditional HR stuff, but it's HR with a little bit of a bigger mandate, right? How do we develop and support individuals, and how do we help them feel motivated? Resource allocation, targets, and forecasts. This is kind of the metrics we use to govern things, how we allocate resources. And then last, and this is kind of last for a reason, is strategy and innovation. I used to do a lot of strategy consulting, and I used to do some innovation consulting. And what we always found is that if we focused here first, that anything we did here would often get killed by stuff out there. And if we didn't get this other stuff right, if we didn't get, sometimes it was our budgeting, some of it was the way we did targets, it really killed innovation efforts. And I've seen this happen again and again and again inside of big organizations, that we'll try to create an innovation lab, and that innovation lab will actually get attacked by the rest of the organization and kind of destroyed, right? So our goal is really to start with the other stuff first, and we believe innovation and good strategy is kind of a natural outcome once you get the other stuff aligned. It's kind of like, if we focus on strategy and innovation, it's kind of like trying to run a marathon without having trained. Here, we're doing all the training, we're building all the systems, we're building all of the stuff and putting all the stuff in place, so when we run the marathon, we're actually in much better shape, right? So I mentioned that this is my final slide. So when we approach change, or when I approach change, there are really two big ways to do it. One is kind of a big bang approach, and I'm doing this right now with a team inside of GE. They're a team that creates new, they recycle old locomotives. They take old trains and they make them new trains. And so we have kind of a unique opportunity there they want to create a brand new business unit, and our opportunity is we've been brought in to actually help them do everything from beginning to end, and it's really wonderful. We have wonderful partners on the other side, and we're able to do kind of a big bang approach. Most of the time, however, I actually have to start with a couple of practices and help people improve their lives a little bit. So kind of going back here, I might start with looking at how people are meeting and how their teams are structured, and I'm trying to look at, this is supposed to demonstrate low-hanging fruit. Like, what is the easiest thing to do that's going to have the biggest impact for the people inside the organization? That allows them to build momentum towards change. It allows them to build trust with us and us to build trust with each other, and then maybe eventually you can move towards kind of a big bang. So that's really all I got for you. This isn't easy. This isn't pleasant most of the time. And often you do require outside help in order to get there. But I think the promise of, when I came here with a promise of speed, and that's not really what I care about. I do care about productive teams, but more as I care about, again, organizations that serve the people inside the organization as well as people outside the organization. The wonderful news is that I think if we can create an organization that is capable of good speed, that is capable of having these small autonomous teams, we can also create organizations that are really serving the people inside the organizations, the people outside the organization. So I don't know if we have time for questions, but more than happy to take them. You can't really see me there. That's my email address. By bob@theready.com. Feel free to reach out to me. Actually, I did write a book. I think that was mentioned in my introduction. And I'm more than happy if you send me an email. I have electronic versions of that book that I'm more than happy to provide to you guys for free, which is really, it's a few years old now, but it holds up. I think it's still a good book. And it really, I had many of my colleagues describe specific aspects of this kind of work. So it's really like stories from the front line about what we know and what we've experienced in terms of creating organizations like this. And with that, thank you all very much. Do we have time for questions, or I'm more than happy to stick around? Yeah. No, I don't. Sorry. I wish. I'm working on it.
Okay, I haven't spoken English for a long time, so I hope I do it well.
You're doing fine.
How do you know how many projects you have to deal with in order to optimize the time and resources?
Yeah. So you know because you test and you learn. You try stuff, you fail, and you adjust and you pivot. And really, I find that it's up to the team to figure that out. So I mentioned this team I'm working with at GE. We're still trying to figure out how projects flow through this system. But in order to do this, we're working with the people who are doing the work. A lot of this work, the thinking behind this, comes from the Toyota production system. Has anybody read the Toyota Way? Yeah, okay. So the idea behind the Toyota production system is, and really where the Toyota production system started was the leaders said, we need to improve our system. And they did something really crazy at those days, was they asked the people who were working in the system how to improve it. And they said, what ideas do you have for improving it? And not only did they ask, but they listened and they responded to them. And they really, and the whole Toyota production system kind of grew out of that sort of philosophy, that sort of mindset. And I think you have to, like, there are many methodologies out there. There's, Scrum, there's Kanban, there's holacracy, which you may have heard of, sociocracy, all of these systems out there. They all have, I think, good pieces to them. They're all valuable. But really, every time you need to install a system, it's sort of custom. And you have to, I always want to work with people and come right back to the principles. And so one of my principles is I work with people to determine what that number is. And we measure, we test stuff, we fail, we try again, and eventually we get it right. For myself, I've found that I do a lot of writing projects. I also do some consulting projects. And so for me, I have space in my brain for only about 5 things a week. So each week, I have maybe 5 things. Sometimes it's 3. It really depends upon the size, the complexity of those things. But I find any more than 5 at a time, things just start kind of bumping into each other, and I start to get confused and upset. So, and I find with many of the teams that I work with that 5 seems to be kind of a magic number. 3 to 5 seems to be the magic number.
Hi, my name is Alan. I just want to ask you, what is the difference between management and leader team?
Management and?
For example, a leader team, you feel safe, and management is an authority.
Yeah.
And how could you improve the innovation in your team? Well, I'm talking about it's different with military team because you save like brothers and sisters. In co-working team, you feel strange. You don't feel that connection. How do you think about this?
Yeah, so the way I think about management, I don't want to be too controversial here, but I feel like one of the big problems we see in organizations often is that there are more managers, like it's the ratio between managers and people doing the work, right? And this is one of the reasons I got into the work that I did, was because I was always working with technology teams, and we could go so far, and then we would find that other aspects of that, that chart I just showed you, other aspects of that chart would damage our efforts. They would actually hurt us in some way. And it was often what I think of as middle management. Like the leadership was really on board, and the workers were on board, but the middle management layer, because that's where the processes live, that's where the tool, and I'm not saying anything against any individual. I think I've worked with some wonderful managers over the years. The map that I use for managers, and also I'll say that I believe every organization needs a lot of people. Like, we need all the people. We don't need to get rid of people, but we might need to change their roles a little bit. And what I find is with managers is that we really want to move the team to be more what I think of as self-managing, right? So the team is responsible for managing themselves. And the mindset shift that this requires inside of a leader is really one from, I think the old school leader was a chess master, right? They could see the board, they could see the multiple moves, and they would tell the people what to do and tell the people how to move. The current mindset I have is much more of a farmer, right? And a farmer has to pay attention to how good the soil is. The farmer has to pay attention to working that soil in a certain kind of way. But ultimately, they're not in complete control, right? How much rain you get, how much, and so what they need to do is set the conditions for success and then step out of the way and let the success come, or let it not come, right? And then say, well, what did we learn? And let's try something else. But the minute a leader comes in and really steps in and tries to control what the team is doing, it ends up damaging the functioning of that team often, right? So one of the jokes that I frequently tell, which is not really a joke at all, is that leaders tend to hire me to help them with team problems. They're like, come and improve my team. And almost all of my work is helping the teams with the management or the leadership problem, right? It's almost always in the context there. And again, I'm not trying to badmouth any specific function or any specific person, because I believe we're all just, living in, I thought theory X, we're all living inside of a theory X world, right? And we've learned, and we're doing really good, like many people are succeeding very well. But because of that mindset, kind of bad stuff is happening. So I'm trying to move teams to be much more self-managing. Again, that autonomy, that sense of autonomy and empowerment, I think is really fundamental. And it's really hard. It's a really hard mindset to move.
Yes, I have a small company since 20 years ago, and what I have learned is that if you have a group, a team, and you just leave them to decide and be autonomous, maybe in Mexico, maybe that's Mexican culture, or in my company, they will choose the easiest way always, less projects and the easy way. So. And in the other way around, you, as a CEO, you have to always put them more projects, or to let's inject energy. So the question is, in Mexico or in some organizations, how can you leave a team autonomous, but how to motivate them so they can ask for more projects as soon as they finish the teams that they are carrying out?
Yeah, this isn't a challenge just in Mexico. This is a challenge everywhere, and I think you're pointing out that it's not just leaders that need to change their mindset, but it's everybody that needs to change their mindset. And so what we often find is that people's behavior is very much a product of their environment, right? So if I was working with your organization, or organizations, I work with organizations like yours, we begin to look at what truly does motivate people, and so and sometimes it's something to do with a connection to the purpose of the organization, right? Like, do we care? Do I really care about that? And so sometimes we have the wrong people in place. Like, I won't say, like, I won't sugarcoat this, right? So sometimes we really do need to hire people who are capable of feeling personal motivation, who are inspired by the purpose of the organization. But often it's also the way we set up the rules of the game. And so when I mentioned before I was talking about like kind of how projects are described. So sometimes we describe projects in a kind of poor way. Like it's in a way that people aren't necessarily able to really connect to the value that they're delivering. I met with a guy this morning who has a piece of software where he's able to track kind of the value that the organization is delivering, and in a way that the people who are doing the tasks are able to actually see that, right? So one of the most motivating things you can do. There's a wonderful book called The Progress Principle by Teresa Amabile. She's from, I think, Columbia University. And there's a wonderful book, and what she describes is that the thing that motivates people the most is being able to make progress on visible progress on a meaningful project. So I started off my career, not this career, but I was a carpenter. I used to build houses, and there was nothing like looking back at the end of the day at the house we had built, that thing we had made. And so sometimes I find that people just aren't able to feel, they're not able to see their progress, or they're not connected to what that progress, how that progress is meaningful. And I also, I think we need to point out that there are some jobs that are hard, right? That are challenging. Like if our work requires, let's say, something like a lot of data entry, that can be a powerfully demotivating task in and of itself. No matter how connected you are to the purpose of it, you could be, saving, babies somewhere, by getting them food. But if your job is just data entry, that's going to be really challenging. And we might need to kind of also work with people around, not putting, like sharing the load a little bit. So I've done a lot of work around data migration projects, and sometimes we have to rotate teams through the bad work and allow them to also embrace kind of the more good work at times, and be able to admit to them, like, yeah, that work is kind of bad, that work is kind of hard, thank you so much for doing it. So there's a lot of stuff in there, but I would say we're looking at kind of the do people feel valued? Are they clear on why what they're doing is important? And are they organized in a small team so they feel accountable to the people that are close to them? Because one of the reasons we do small teams is because if I know I'm letting down, my friend David, rather than I'm just not getting this task done, it's a very, very different mindset, right? So we tend to want to measure teams collectively and give teams bonuses collectively, reward teams collectively, so people feel really connected they feel accountable to those people. That was a very long answer. Hopefully there was something decent in there. Yeah.
First of all, Bob, thanks for all your knowledge and sharing all these slides with us. I have two questions. The first one is, how will you build a resilient team in order to achieve a responsive organization? And the second one is, what are your thoughts about this idiom that says hire slow and fire fast?
Yeah. So I say hire slow and fire fast all the time. So I believe in it, like that we want to determine very, very quickly whether or not someone is a match. And we want to take our time to determine, right, whether or not somebody is a match. And I think this isn't unlike dating, right? Like you don't just like go on one date and then marry somebody, right? But we often go on one job interview and get hired, and then we're expected to be there and be dedicated to the company for life or for a very long period of time, right? So in my organization, we spend a lot of time, we actually give people tests, we do test projects with people, we let them get to know us, we get to know them, we see if we're really aligned, and then we kind of take our time getting to know somebody, and if we determine somebody is not a fit for the organization, we're going to let them go very quickly, kindly, but quickly, right? Because we can't, the effect of a bad person in an organization can be high. How do you build a team? That's a much, much longer conversation. I do a process it's called a team charter, which is, I don't have a slide of it handy, but it's actually a smaller set of items than this, but we tend to talk about the purpose of the team. We'll talk about the roles that people will play on the team, and I have certain ideas about specific roles, not just functional roles, not just like skill set roles, but I think every team needs to have a facilitator, like somebody who's responsible for making sure that team meets, making sure that when meetings happen that we stay on agenda. I think it's best not have that person be the person who owns the team, not to have it be the highest paid person, because that person has too much power, but have it to be somebody less junior. Sometimes we rotate that role through people, but anyway, how are we going to handle the roles? We talk about the practices, how often are we going to meet, when we do meet, what are we going to talk about? And again, I have some specific ideas about that. And then more than that, I also have another process that I'll run sometimes with teams where I really want the team, especially the team is going to be a long-living team, like a team, and especially if it's an intense project, that I actually have them talk to each other about what do they personally want out of the project? Like, more than what the customer wants, what is your intention? You have a career goal. You have maybe a financial goal in life. You probably want to learn something. You probably want to advance. So given all of these things that you have, these personal motivations you have, let's listen to each other and let's hear each other about what we really want. And that's so I can get more empathy for you, you can get more empathy for me. Sometimes it's very scary to say these things, so a little bit of vulnerability can kind of bond people together a little bit. And the last thing I'll say is that we also want to have practices that teams get better and better and better over time. So the team has to, I usually do this on a monthly basis, once a month, come together and answer 3 questions. What's working? Where are we getting stuck? And what can we do differently in order to address those things? It's called a retrospective in my world. You can call it whatever you like. Some people call it a post-mortem, but I don't believe in waiting for a project to end to do it. You have to do it while the team is working. And so the team has to commit to not only continually getting better at delivering value to the customer, but to get better at being a team. And so the foundation, like this team charter, is really important, right? You get the foundation set, you have a firm foundation to leap off from, but then you have to kind of commit to this kind of idea of continuous improvement and getting better and better and better over time. Cool, thanks.
Oh, tenéis aquí a un asesor de escala internacional y no tenéis ninguna pregunta. Bueno, sois listísimos todos. Ahora sí.
One more question. I'm taking advantage of your presence.
Wonderful.
They say that the best, let's say, thing you can do to work very hard and well and with quality is to have a little bit of stress. I mean, not a little, like medium stress.
Yeah.
So you agree with that?
I completely agree. Yes. Yeah. I think this is something like, so when we talk about like the theory X, right? So theory X is, in that world, we avoid work, and I've done it myself. You know, like I've avoided work many times in my life. Even when I was a carpenter, you know, like if I could get away with an extra half hour for lunch, I would take an extra half hour for lunch, and I would avoid it. And have you guys ever noticed that really rich people seem a little bit crazy? Have you noticed that? Like their behavior just doesn't seem very healthy for them or for the people around them. Like, have you watched like reality TV? You watch like these, you know, like, and I think part of the problem is because when you're really rich, you don't have to, you don't feel like you have to do work. You don't feel like you have to be productive often. But I believe that if we are not productive, that it makes us a little bit crazy, right? That people very, very naturally, again, we care about each other, right? We're a social species, and we care about, like, nothing feels better to me than when I come and give a talk, or than when I go and do a job, and somebody comes up to me and says, "Thank you, you've made a difference for me," right? That's better than any money that I ever receive, right? Don't get me wrong, I still want the money because I have a house in New York City, right? But at the same time, that's not why I do it. Why I do it is because I enjoy the person-to-person, motivation. And I think when we begin to avoid work and we try to relax, and our goal becomes how much time can we relax, that we, and I've done this again for myself. I've spent my, my life, I was middle management, for a time myself, and I would try to get out of work all the time, and I would try to, and I just found like a little crazy. And right now, I actually prefer a challenge. So I'm starting a couple of things on the side right now. I also have consulting business. Honestly, I'm in New York, I'm in Mexico City thinking, hey, could we maybe open an office in Mexico City? So I'm trying many things, and it's a little bit stressful, kind of freaks me out a little bit. My income kind of goes like this a little bit. My wife gets a little bit nervous, we all do. But I also find that I'm more engaged, I'm happier, I'm healthier. And so what that tells me is that if I'm working with teams, that we need, like a little bit of stress, a little bit of excitement can push people. And of course, there are people like Steve Jobs who put a lot of stress and excitement on their team, and he managed to get massive amounts of productivity out of his teams. But I think Steve Jobs, let's not take management lessons from Steve Jobs. Can I just say that? Do not take management lessons from Steve Jobs. He was a unique individual with a unique vision. Did that help? Yeah, cool.
Okay, hi.
Hi.
Well, there's something you just explained to us about these fulfilling activities that are challenging, interesting, meaningful, and everything. But normally, most of organizations have boring and I don't know, like non-meaningful tasks. And this it's very complex to help to build teams that must face that challenges or that activities, and they say, okay, there's an enormous disconnection between the things that are valuable for me and the things that the company are trying to achieve. They want more money, and they don't mind whatever, I don't know, if I have a sick child at home, or if I am boring of getting, I don't know, serving mad people or mean people in a restaurant or things like that. How could we face that challenge of making people involved when the task is not that interesting?
Yeah, yeah. It's a challenge. So there's two things. One is that yes, there's always going to be some work that's that's bad. There's always going to be the bad jobs, and I think if we can share the load on those bad jobs, and if we can help people understand why those bad jobs are essential to the organization achieving its purpose, then we can begin to connect. And maybe we also have to pay a little more for the bad jobs, right? So maybe money, there are different levers we can use. But the other thing I'll say is that in most organizations, I'll draw in the air here. So we have like the big organization and the purpose of the organization. And then we have a smaller circle, which is sort of like, let's call it the purpose of the division of that. And then maybe we have a product, and then maybe we have a team, and then maybe we have a daily task. So this could be, you could decompose it through time, or like, so the purpose is like, over 20 years it's going to achieve the purpose, and then over 5 years it's going to achieve a program, and over a year it'll build a product, and so forth. And then we get down to the daily stuff, right? The stuff that everybody has to do on a daily basis. What I find is that in most organizations, because of the way we're structured, is there's a huge disconnect between those two things. As a matter of fact, the stuff that we're doing down here, only like a quarter of it is valuable to the real purpose of the organization. There's a lot of waste inside that organization. And so if we can begin to organize around these teams and say, your job, let's take a kind of typical function, like we have sales, we have HR, and we have finance, right? And so rather than trying to like do central planning for all those things, instead if we create a team and we say, HR, your job is to make sure we have enough people, make sure those people are happy, and make sure that we have a good process for getting rid of people that aren't, right? Right? Yeah, that's your job. And then you have autonomy over taking care of that, right? And then human resources could even like create smaller teams and smaller teams and smaller teams and give them a similar sense of mission, right? So the language that we use a lot is a mission-based team. So if I'm working with 5 other people and I'm like, oh, I have a mission to do, and that mission is really clearly related to the mission of my department, which is really clearly related to the mission of the organization, and there's not much waste, and I have autonomy, I feel empowered, and when I do stuff, when I try stuff, I don't get fired because something fails. I've created an environment where taking risk is encouraged. Then I feel like I can feel a lot more motivated. And then if I have to do data entry or something boring as a part of that, I can feel a lot more connected to the sense of purpose, right? There's an old story about a guy, somebody encountered somebody like sweeping, on a construction site, and they like, what are you doing? And he's like, I'm building a cathedral, right? I'm sweeping up right now, but I'm connected to this thing. I know that this cathedral doesn't get built without me sweeping up right now. And so I feel personally invested in that. And I think, we're humans, we love purpose. We love a sense of purpose. And I think many organizations just do a bad job of communicating purpose, and they also are structured in a way that you feel disconnected from it. And so we're just trying to connect people to that purpose more is really valuable.
¿Alguien más tiene alguna pregunta? Muy bien.
Bob is a big planner, a dreamer.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think are key learning for ensuring that Bob executes what Bob planner has in mind?
So what are the things to get the execution done?
No,
Oh, sorry.
in your experience
In my experience, yeah.
with Bob Planner,
Uh-huh.
you want to be a big executor.
Yeah. So, I mean, I will say that execution is what it's all about, right? It's not about planning. If I think about planning, so the way I think about planning, this onion, this kind of thing that I just described, right? I think of you have to have layers of planning as well. And so on the daily level, I want people to be actually replanning. So there's this idea, most organizations, the way they run and the way they plan is they create a plan and then they just let the plan kind of run, right? They don't rethink about the plan. Maybe once a year they have an annual planning cycle, and maybe they'll think, maybe they'll do something quarterly as well, potentially. And what we create is we create an environment that's very much like a rocket, right? Like, so if I'm going to set a rocket off, I kind of set it up, I angle it, and then it has to blast off. But once it's going, I can't really course correct. What I'm interested in is organizations that are a little more like bicycles, where we're kind of constantly taking some small course corrections, and those course corrections are participatory. So everybody has some kind of say, and so we actually have some kind of participatory process. So what I advise organizations to do is on a daily basis, a team should talk to each other and say, what did we do yesterday? What are we doing tomorrow? Where am I blocked? Where could I use some help? Right? So there's like this daily cycle. And then maybe a group of teams might have a monthly cycle where they'll come together and they'll say, what's important to this? What's important to us? Let's look at some data. Let's see how we're doing. But the planning is all focused on the execution. So the execution is feeding data into the planning, and the people who are doing the work are able to replan continuously and continuously and continuously. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Did I answer your question?
Not really.
Okay. Try again. Let's try again.
Well, that gives me a lot of information. Thank you.
Okay, yeah.
But I was more into, in your personal experience,
Yeah.
some habits that you could share with us for the way that you have aligned the execution
Yeah.
with the
planning.
with the planning, the
Yeah.
creativity, the dreams that you may have.
Yeah, sure. So I'm going to share my favorite tool with you, all right? And it does actually relate to what I just talked about, this kind of cycle. So I work with several teams, and I also, I kind of do some projects by myself as well. Every project I do and every team that I work on, I have a weekly meeting that we call an action meeting. And that action meeting, and we do a couple of things during that action meeting. The first thing we do is we actually check in with each other personally. How's it going? How are you feeling? What's going on? Like, did you just take your kid to the dentist, and are you, or is your dog, at the vet, and are you worried? Like just getting some personal interaction. The second thing we do is we look at the data. We say we have metrics that we're tracking for every project, and these metrics relate to the success and the intent of that project. So how are we doing? We don't go deeply into the analyzation. We don't do a lot of metrics. We try to pick like 3 to 5 metrics to track, but we track those metrics. The other thing we do is we look at the projects we've got going. So remember, like the team has those like little chunks. So we've described those chunks, and we look at those projects, and we say, how are these projects doing? And all of this takes about 5 to 8 minutes, right? We're a small team, so we get a lot of what I think of as situational awareness. It's what the military would call, am I aware of my situation, right? How is the data doing? How are my teammates doing? How are my projects doing? I answer those questions. The next thing I do is I allow anybody on the team to put something onto a list. We call it a triage list. Triage comes from healthcare, right? So if someone comes to the hospital, if you have all these people coming into the hospital, you have to check like who's the most important, so a triage list. And so the idea is that we just say, so everybody on the team is capable of saying, I need to talk about this, and I need to talk about that. So we just create a list. It's a dynamic thing. So I take another 2 or 3 minutes, and I just have everybody put things up on a list. The next thing I do is I go through that list. So again, I mentioned having a facilitator. So the facilitator then turns to the first item on the list, or maybe we look at what's the most important item on the list. We might do a quick prioritization, but we'll look at an item, and it has a name next to it, and I'll say, John, what do you need? And then they'll bring it up and we'll have a quick conversation. And that conversation, it may become a task, it may become a project, we may get rid of it, it may become a new metric because we're like, oh, we need to track this metric. But the team is dynamically generated with the team, and it's all focused around the work that we're doing. We work through those items one at a time, and then we create a list of these are the things we're doing this week, and these are the things that we've done. And so we create a task list essentially for that week. We create a planning session. I like to use a tool called Trello for this, but there's many. You could also use like a Post-it note on a wall. People know the tool Trello? Trello? Okay, so it's an online tool. Oh, I'm not connected to the internet, so I can't show you. But it's an online tool that allows you to kind of manage a list like this. And I'm happy to, if you, again, send me an email, I will share a screenshot and I'll share a link to that with you. But I will say this, what you're highlighting is, when I say we organize in a dynamic way, one of the fundamental principles of this is that we organize around the work. We don't organize around the team. We don't make the work and bend the work to the team. If the team isn't capable of doing the work, we change the team. And so we organize around the work, not around the team, not around the organization. The lights came on. Is that because we need to go or no?
Thank you.
It's just. Okay, cool.
Hi, Bob. This is Cesar Garcia. Actually, we run an IT startup. For sure, every day we face a lot of problems, but lately one of the biggest problems we have is the communication or the organization between the sales team and the IT developers. So, which is a good strategy to fix these kind of problems? Because I know it's not uncommon.
Yeah, it's not uncommon at all, and it's kind of where I started my career. I have an article online about this, which I call it the wall, right? There's a wall that exists between usually the business organization and the execution organization, right? And just in principle, there are many practices that you can apply to this, but in principle, I would say you have to have them talk on a really regular basis, and you have to have them, again, this idea of cross-functional teams, you have to have that team feel collaborative and cross-functional. One of the ways, you might look at some of the, Heinrich Nyberg from Spotify has written some good articles on how Spotify does their execution, and they've kind of solved for this problem. But one of the things you do is you create a team, and then each team has a product owner who is who essentially works on the business side. And then you might have several teams, but each team has a product person. And then that product team, all of the product people, also have to be kind of collaborative and work together and share resources, right? I don't feel like we have enough time to really get into it, but the idea is, or I don't have enough knowledge, honestly, of your system, but the basic principle is that you need to get people talking to each other, and you need to do things that are both cultural, sometimes, as well as procedural. And sometimes the best thing you can do is bring the people together and say, you know, like, you guys figure this out. We have this problem. We need to feel like we're part of the same team. And when I have, you know, like, and so this is where I sometimes use this tool, and I'll take this chart, and I'll say, give everybody Post-it notes, and I'll say, you know, like, I'll have red and green Post-it notes, and I'll say what's working and what's not working in each of these sections. The other thing we might do is we might say, and actually in my workshop that I teach at Sedim, one of the things we do in that workshop is people bring in a problem, and then and this is what I do with my consultants as well, so we have a problem, we say, okay, let's ask why that problem is happening, right? So sales is not talking to the developers. They're misaligned, they're unaligned. That's my problem. So we can talk about what's the impact of that problem, like how does that negatively impact the customer, and sometimes that can create a sense of urgency around changing it. But if we're going to solve it, we have to kind of go back to a tool, either this tool or a tool like this, and say, okay, they're not talking to each other. That's kind of a sort of a people and development and motivation problem. It's sort of a strategy and innovation problem. So now, and we talk to everybody. I don't do it myself, but I talk to everybody. It's like, well, where's showing up? Do we have a policy that's making this show up in a bad way? Or do we have, is it the way our team's structured? Is that driving this thing? And so then we, if you remember the Toyota production system, the Toyota has a thing they call 5 whys, right? So if I ask, here's my problem, I describe my problem, why is that happening? Okay, so now I describe that. And then I get to say, okay, why is that happening? And I go deeper and deeper and deeper. It's kind of a root cause analysis, right? And without doing that with your team, I can't say exactly what the problem is, but I would say probably people aren't feeling like they're on the same team. You know, like sometimes, you know, like, and I think this is really common, is the product person or the business person is like, why aren't you giving me everything I need? I need features to go tell my customers that I've got these features, and you guys are lazy and bad, and they're treating people right like Theory X. And then the development team is like, well, we're doing the best we can, and you guys keep shoving more work on us, and we're not we don't feel, you know, we feel like we're second class. This happens sometimes. Like we don't feel like we're the most important people here, and we feel unmotivated or you know, we don't feel like we can say no. We just have to say yes to you all the time. And so sometimes there's like a cultural disconnect, right? I don't know what your organization is like, but just describing some common patterns that I see. Thank you.
¿Alguien más? ¿Nadie? Bueno, muchas gracias otra vez a todos por venir. Bob, muchísimas gracias. Thank you for coming here. Y bueno, os recuerdo el favorcito que os pedí de las tarjetas por ambas caras. Y pues os quiero comunicar de parte de CEDIM, ahora que conocéis un poquito más sobre nosotros y sobre nuestros expertos, tenemos, como veis también en las tarjetas, diferentes posgrados a los que podéis acceder y además estamos abriendo el departamento de becas pues para enero, nuestros próximos certificado y máster. Si estáis interesados podríais acceder a una beca, obviamente después de una selección y un proceso. Entonces, cualquier tipo de información, lo que necesitéis, yo estoy a vuestra disposición. Tengo ahí mi tarjeta, el que quiera pues me puede pedir la tarjeta y gracias otra vez por venir, ha sido un placer. En Santa Fe, si conocen Samara o La Lavadora, ahí en Samara tenemos nuestra sede del otro lado de la Ibero y pues ahí es